My name's Raj Patel, and I am, among other things, a professor at the University of Texas at Austin's Lyndon Baines Johnson School of Public Affairs. But also, I'm an anti-hunger activist, and I have been since I was 5 years old. And part of that anti-hunger activism has involved working at organizations like the World Bank and the World Trade Organization and the United Nations. Part of that anti-hunger activism has involved protesting against some of these organizations. And part of that has involved writing books and doing research. And now this documentary, which is also part of the work that I've been doing for many years. And that's why I'm very grateful that you watched the film and read Inflamed, which is also part of that world as well. So thank you for having me.
For like being here. So your documentary is so cool. It was so inspiring to watch. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you. I mean, that's all because of Anita and the work that women like her and men in Malawi and around the world are doing. And I was just lucky enough to be able to join them.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you so much. Yes. All right. I know that a lot of students that are here have read the book, or at least the first section of the book. One of our questions is, what do you mean by the anatomy of injustice? I know it's kind of a large question, but just kind of a brief definition to.
My goodness. Well, so the idea of, I mean, injustice, obviously, I think, but we can understand what that means. But anatomy refers to a couple of things. When we talk about anatomy, what we're doing is pointing out how different parts of the body are connected and how it is that they work together. And when we're talking about how injustice has its anatomies, what we're doing is both talking about, in this book, we organize it by the different systems in the body. And a lot of the work in this book is talking about systems within systems. And so when we're talking about the anatomy of injustice, we're really talking about how what looks like unfairness over here or sexism in one part of the world is actually connected to racism, obviously in the same place, but also elsewhere. And it's also connected to histories of how some people were thrown off the land and then it got renamed Wisconsin. Those complicated histories look like they're separate, but they have an anatomy that we can trace if we look carefully and are ready to sort of live with and understand the systems that connect them. So I hope that helps.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it's like a body, like everything's very connected and like one thing affects the other and it's kind of like this domino effect.
Well, and that's right. And one of the other things that we're doing in the book is pointing out that what looks to be a single body, like our bodies are not just one animal. We are, in fact, the technical term is holobiont, but we are an assembly of lots of different living things. There are lots of things inside our guts, for example, that are not human, but allow us to be human. And so when we're thinking about anatomies, we're also really taking a pot shot at the old-fashioned way of saying, well, this is my body and it's only one thing. Whereas in fact, we're an assembly of lots of different things. We're like lichen, for example, which is a mixture of plants and fungi. We're lots of different things connected to one another. And we identify as one thing, but actually we're several.
That's really interesting, kind of thinking about like how we intersect with so many different others.
I agree, yes. Should we go from like the first chapter?
Sure.
Yeah, so these are some more questions from students reading like your first chapter of your book. One of them was, is there like a certain experience or like a certain moment in your life that first inspired you to write this book? And if so, what is it?
Look, there are a few, but thank you for the invitation for this question. I mean, the big moment for me when that made me want to think about hunger, and this book, it says it's about medicine, and it is, but the distinction between food and medicine doesn't exist in so many cultures. And so for me, the ideas of justice, of food, of hunger, and of healing all kind of come together in a moment when I was 5. We were in India, in the land of my ancestors, and we were in an old car, sort of pottering along in the middle of the monsoon, like this huge rainy season. And we stopped at a traffic light and it was late. And there was a girl who's about 12 years old and she had an infant in her arms and she was knocking at the window saying, please give us money, we're hungry, we're wet, we've got no money, we're starving. And I was 5 years old and I was looking up at her, and I was just, it broke me. I was so sad. I was angry. I was upset. I was asking my mum, on whose lap I was sitting at the time. I was like, well, why are we, why are we rich and she's poor, and why do we have food and she's not, and why are we dry and she's wet? And anyway, my mum sort of crammed, they sort of rolled down the window, because that's what you used to do, and then popped some money out and rolled up the window again, and off we sped. But it's I carry that girl with me everywhere. And when I got back to London, I started renting out toys in kindergarten, so that we could raise money to end hunger. And the work of ending hunger is what I've been doing pretty much since then, in one form or another. So writing this book was actually a lovely encounter between me and my friend Rupa Maria. Rupa and I met more than 10 years ago now. She was singing in her band. She's also, she's a physician, but she's also a musician. And she was in a band, and I was dressed up as a genetically modified tomato, because we were protesting industrial agriculture and the sort of poisoning of our planet through industrial chemistry. And we met there and we became friends. And then we realized, over time, that we needed to tell a story about food and medicine in a way that no one else could.
That's really interesting. I feel like it's so interesting that you connected with it at such a young age, and that it kind of you carried that with you for the rest of kind of your life, and that's what your life's work is. I know that in your book, a lot of people had a lot of questions about colonization, and one of the questions was, do you believe that the world is currently on the right track to decolonization, and kind of why or why not?
Well, so thank you. I saw in that list of questions, a lot of folk were interested in, well, what is it actually, and why am I banging on about it? Why say it so often? And in part, here we are living in the United States, and it's so easy to remember. It's easy to forget. Every day, y'all be taking the Pledge of Allegiance, and you'll be, talking about one nation under God. And you're being miseducated every day when you say that, because the United States has hundreds of nations, and those are indigenous nations that still remain despite our best attempts to colonize them. And so, we live in a settler society, and every day we're taught to forget. And so if it feels like I'm saying colonization a little too often in this book, it's only because you're being told every day that no such thing exists, and that we are, that we have every right to this land, and that if there were indigenous people, they're off on the reservation. We're very sorry, we've exterminated everyone. And in fact, that's not the story. The story is still of we are a settler country that is in the process of colonizing, and we're still doing it. Every day we're trying, and every day we must fight. So what is it to colonize? Well, to colonize is essentially, the Pledge of Allegiance that y'all do every day is a moment of colonization, because it encourages a carelessness. If there were a better word, we'd use it. But colonization is really about not caring about things, about forgetting, a certain kind of amnesia, where you forget who used to live on this land. You forget that there are connections between living beings that matter, that you forget that you are being cared for by the planet, and you forget that it's not okay to treat the thing that cares for you so badly. But here we are, we're in a world where carelessness is rendered normal. And so the question you're asking is are we on the right track to rediscover our care for one another, and our care for the histories of the places we find ourselves, and our care for the planet? And I'm torn. On the one hand, there are lots of politicians and lots of large corporations who think, either in terms of the next 3 months, the next financial quarter, or maybe the next election cycle, if that. And those aren't the periods of care in which living beings operate. We can and do care over generations. We care for our elders, we care for our children, we care for our friends and families in ways that outlast those short time horizons. And part of our mission as beings on this earth is to rediscover that care to one another. I prefer to think that it's possible for us to rediscover that, in part because people like Anita are showing us not only that you can, but you have to, in order to survive. I'm very interested in surviving. I'm very interested in living on a planet where everyone is doing well. But to do that, we have to rediscover not our guns or our ideas of liberty or our ideas of sacred private property, but other kinds of ways of caring. And that means taking a lot more radical action than we've seen so far. And if you in middle and high school are thinking, us in my generation and older have really done wrong by you, you're absolutely right. You have every right to be furious with us. But I think giving up is not an option. I think the right thing to do is to be thinking quite radically about what sorts of care need to be brought and what you need to do in order to be able to enforce that. And I think that there are carers everywhere who I'm inspired by. It's people like Anita, it's people who are stopping line 3, it's people who are fighting the expansion of fossil fuels and the contamination of water, people who are fighting for the rights of rivers and lives in forests. And I think there are glimmers of hope that we have to hang on to, that we need to fan, because otherwise we will all be headed for a very, very dark future. So I do think it's possible. I think the data shows that if we take some fairly aggressive action over the next few years, we stand a chance of avoiding a world of catastrophic climate change. But I don't want to pretend that it will be done without a fight. There are quite a lot of people who would like to pretend that we could go back to normal, pretend that a world where already 2 billion people going hungry in 2019 before the pandemic, a world where we had lifespans shortening before COVID, that was normal and desirable and preferable. And I think we do need some fairly drastic transformations in the way we hold ourselves and hold one another.
I agree. And I think it's really powerful how you connect colonization to not caring, because I agree in that we can't afford to not care, because if we don't care, then by the time that we do, it's going to be too late. It's really about appreciating, I think it's appreciating we're not one nation, we're many, and appreciating what we have and the earth that supports us and all that. So I totally agree. I think that it's a really good connection. And kind of related to the same topic of colonization, how do you see our future regarding colonial information?
I'm not sure what that means. I saw that question. I wanted to ask, well, what is colonial information exactly?
Yes, exactly. I think that this might relate more to kind of what we were talking about before, as we get if we instead of decreasing and going on the track like you were saying to caring and respecting our earth and each other, we're kind of going on the opposite track. Do you see us going backwards, I guess, from where we want to be?
Well, I do, but I mean, just to bring in the classes that were thinking about the film more directly. I mean, I think one of the things that we are encouraged to forget is that we in the United States live on the same planet as a whole bunch of other people. And often when it comes to thinking about, one of the ways that colonialism can operate is, again, by making us forget that we have duties of care and a history with the rest of the planet. Look, I was born in London. My parents were born in Kenya and in Fiji. There's no reason why that should happen and that my ancestors should come from India, other than a long history of colonialism by the British, which is also responsible for the colonization in part of this country. Obviously, the French and the Portuguese and the Spanish had a hand, but let's also be clear that there is quite a lot of European colonization that is ongoing. Part of that colonization involves spreading myths and lies about what the rest of the world is like and what the rest of the world is capable of. And the reason that we made the ants and the grasshopper was because a lot of times there's the notion, and you'll see this throughout your lives, sadly, and I would encourage you to fight it whenever you can. But there's this idea of sort of the white savior, of some sort of messiah coming from the rich country, going to the poor country and making everything better. And that sort of savior complex is part of what allows international development aid and aid organizations to behave essentially like they used to under colonial times in their sort of pre-colonial forms. The reason we made this film was to say, hey, you know what? You've been told in America that the only way that you can really change things is by buying organic and shopping at the farmer's market and eating kale, and that if you do this enough, everything's going to be fine. Now, don't get me wrong, I like kale. I do go to the farmer's market. I do buy organic, and this is great. But be under no illusions that your shopping choices are going to save the planet from shopping and from consumerism and from modern capitalism. That's just not going to happen. But what the film shows is that, these are really big problems. These are huge problems. Climate change is huge. Sexism and patriarchy, massive. The histories of colonialism and of the problems of whiteness, massive. And farmers have it tough. Now, rather than merely saying, look, go to the farmer's market, everything's fine. What this film says is, who's got some good ideas? The people on the front lines, whether it's working class white Americans, whether it's working class Black Americans, or whether it's Africans in Malawi who are farming and realize that, if we want to feed ourselves and our village, what we need is to farm in ways that are radically different from what Monsanto or these large corporations or someone from the United States Agency for International Development is telling us to do. We need to farm using corn and beans and squash. We need to farm in ways that adapt to the microclimate of this particular bit of soil. We need to farm in ways that recognize that we don't have pesticides, but there are going to be pests and we're going to manage them ecologically. We're going to have to farm in ways that conserve water, that are frugal with any kind of external input, that are that really build a rich soil fertility in land that's been denuded of all of that. And then we need to fight sexism. We need to make men do their fair share. I will be fighting the sexism that is in me, because this is we are still a patriarchal society here in America, and I benefit from it, and I will do, I'll die fighting it because I have to. And that's not me being woke. It's just what I do in order to be free. And in the same way, you'll see Winston in the film fighting his patriarchy because he's working on it, and he's a work in progress. He's like someone recovering from substance abuse or something. It's a trap that he needs to be constantly vigilant that he doesn't fall down again, and that's part of the new normal. And it's fine. It's good, right? To be constantly vigilant that you don't fall back into these horrific things that folk used to do. But that's just part of the work, and it's a big problem, and it requires a big solution. And here are people who are not shying away from that. They're not saying, "Look, eat kale and cross your fingers." They're saying, "No, actually, we can take on patriarchy. We can end hunger. We can do all of these things." So, if we're talking about colonial information, what colonial information does is miseducate us about who gets to think and who gets to feel. Under colonialism, who's allowed to think? It's only, the colonists. Only they are allowed to have science. And so women who are vaccinating children, actually, the smallpox, the history of the smallpox vaccine, very interesting. I was having a conversation with someone from The Economist magazine, and they were like, yes, we love science. Sir Edward Jenner discovered the smallpox vaccine in the late 1700s, and he wrote it up, and then, it ended up being spread around the world. It was lovely. And the truth is, no, women in Egypt were vaccinating children in the early 1700s, before Jenner was born. But it took his validation, because women were not allowed to be scientists, women were not allowed to think, women were not allowed to experiment. It was only Jenner and his writings controlled in certain circuits of power that then allowed the idea of the smallpox vaccine to really gain hold. So, whether it was the milkmaids or the women who were vaccinating kids in Egypt, they weren't allowed to be scientists. They weren't allowed to think. And similarly, who's allowed to feel? Again, only certain kinds of people are allowed to have suffering. And there's a racialized component to that, and there's a gendered component to that. So, the way that the smallpox vaccine was brought to the United States was actually through the bodies of small boys on transport ships across the Atlantic, and those young people their suffering didn't amount to a whole bunch, that they were orphans, they were wards of the state, and it was okay for them to be infected with cowpox as part of the sort of vaccine chain. So if we're thinking about colonial information, it's about regulating who can think and who can feel, and decolonization and information that shows the opposite of that is what the Ants and the Grasshopper film is about. It's saying, hey, you know what? A whole bunch of people can think and a whole bunch of people can feel, and their lives and their suffering is as equal is equal to yours. And that's not a message that colonialism can stand. So yeah, it's a long answer, but I did want to bring in the folk who have been watching the film and may not know some of these ideas that are in the book.
Yeah, for sure. No, and I think it's also just looking at the film and the juxtaposition between the two different countries and the idea of the kind of normal trope of the white savior versus like how Anita had come to America to talk about personal opinion, which is kind of the best kind of form of information. But then I guess another question was talking about Western healthcare systems and how we could, I guess, as a generation and as just people in general, what is our role as part of the Western healthcare system? What can we do, and how can we become more of a world sorry, how can we look at it from more of a worldview versus just our specific system and our specific country?
Well, I mean, there are still lots of ways that America is behind the rest of even the wealthy world, right? We spend nearly 20% of our gross domestic product on healthcare, and we get much worse healthcare than pretty much every other country for that spend. Our life expectancy is much shorter than comparable countries spending much less money than we do, and that's partly because so much of our healthcare really is about administration and denying people care because of the healthcare industry. But I mean, I grew up in London with free healthcare and free education. These are normal things in certainly when I was growing up. I went to a state school. I went to Oxford, and that's a government. Oxford and Cambridge are government schools, and the London School of Economics, the University of London, these are all state schools. And I went for free. I saw the best. When I was needing to see a neurologist, I saw the world's best neurologists, and it didn't cost me a penny. And it was a great system, basically all around, but it's still subject to racism. I mean, if you look at who's dying in Britain at the moment, it's still, disproportionately the working class and people of color. And that's it's so all of this is to say, look, if we're interested in a healthcare system that's decolonized, certainly stopping doing care for profit and turning around to a care system where we're all caring for one another with not on the basis of ability to pay, that's a reasonable thing to do, and so many countries are doing it. The other point, though, is that healthcare needs to care more. Right now, it's really based on these old colonial principles. And thinking about food and medicine together is tremendously important, because understanding that actually, one of the great gifts that healthcare might give us is the opportunity never to go to a hospital. That we might never need to go to a hospital if our healthcare system is doing its job. That means that we need to be looking at things like what get called sort of lifestyle, whether that's the food system or whether that one of the stories that we talk about in the book is debt. I'm sad to say that under the systems under which you find yourselves, you will experience this in one form or another, and hopefully not acutely, but you will find yourself at some point being offered loans. And you may find yourself, if you are unfortunate, and to be unfortunate in America is merely just to be not born rich these days, then you will find yourself worrying about being able to feed your families. And then all of a sudden, here comes a loan that will bridge your need to feed your family today between now and when your paycheck comes next week. And if you take these payday loans, your risk of suicide goes up and your risk of accidental drug overdose goes up. And this is just the way that we care for one another in America, which is to say very badly. If we had a healthcare system that was serious, then we wouldn't have people living on poverty wages where there was no money for food for a week reliably every month. And we wouldn't subject people to these kinds of usury. We wouldn't have loans that actively damage people's health. And there are ways in which we can care for one another, in which everyone has a living wage. It means, yes, that we would have maybe we'd have fewer billionaires, and frankly, I don't think we should have any. I think $1 billion is quite a lot, and what are you going to do with that? No, $1 billion is not something anyone should have while we still have hunger on this earth. So I do think that there are ways of redistributing wealth. I mean, it's not like Elon Musk is working so hard that he needs the money, right? I mean, this is all about stock market wealth being funneled to him in sort of speculative form. And what's Jeff Bezos done? He's managed to distrust people so actively that he's underpaying his workforce and basically scalping the poor in order to be able to find great customer service. I will take things arriving a few days late if everyone gets to eat, if everyone is given a living wage. I'm fine with that. And I don't see why we should basically grind people into the dirt so that we can get our fidget spinners like that. It's just a preposterous system we find ourselves in. So long story short, if we are interested in care, if we are interested in engaging with one another, and if we are interested in a healthcare system that stops us going to hospital, then we do need to be looking at these social determinants of health and their long histories. And that's what Anita's doing. Like she's saying, look, one of the great problems for making sure that everyone gets to eat is gender inequality. So let's make sure that we have equality. We can do that. It's going to take work, though, because there are a whole bunch of men who don't want to give up power. And in the same way, there's a whole bunch of rich people who don't want to merely pay their fair share. They would rather make us pick up the tab, and that's not okay.
That's very true. And it seems like today, like the entire country is on very polarizing end. Like there's the very rich and the very poor. And so we're at these very extreme ends. There's a lot of tension in between those. How have you seen the COVID pandemic, uncovering these problems in our healthcare and really like pushing that change for better care for people as we go into the future?
Well, I mean, look at who's thrown under the bus first when COVID happens, right? I mean, here in Texas, the two hotspots for COVID were prisons and slaughterhouses, and disproportionately then working class and people of color. And think of who the essential workers are for whom we maybe occasionally applauded during the pandemic, but who are still working for basically minimum wage. Those groups are the ones who were designed to insulate the middle class in America from too much suffering. And I mean, COVID certainly revealed the folk on whom society depends. And then we're almost immediately forgetting about them now. It's only because there mercifully have been certain kinds of industrial action where people are like, you know what, I'm tired of being treated like dirt. I'm not asking to drive a Bentley. All I'm saying is I need to be able to feed my family. Give me a wage that lets me do that. And so the industrial actions and strikes that we're seeing at the moment are good signs of that. The other thing, though, that has been really interesting, and this is something you see in The Ants and the Grasshopper, is how communities care for one another. Under COVID, some communities came together, and whether it was about folk feeding one another or making sure that elders were well taken care of, all of these duties of care flourished under COVID, in ways that showed that it was possible. Now, again, in a patriarchal society, who is it that picked up most of the work of care? It was women, and in America as well as everywhere else. But they're in more egalitarian places, certainly in Anita's village, that care work was distributed more equitably. And again, it's a reminder that it is possible for us to imagine a very drastically different world. But COVID, pointed out, first of all, how fragile this world is, and continues to point that out, by the way. I mean, Anita has had one dose of vaccine, but she hasn't had two, I don't think. Peter Mazunda, the camera person, got 1 dose of the AstraZeneca vaccine and then got COVID. And he lost 2 people on a film crew that he was working with to COVID. They died from COVID. He managed to survive, but he's living with the after effects. And a lot of the world still hasn't been vaccinated. And so let's not. I mean, obviously, we can't pretend now that we're all sitting with our masks on. Y'all are, and the pandemic isn't over, but it won't be over until everyone is safe. And that's what what COVID has revealed, that we are all interconnected, that there will be other variants until everyone is vaccinated, no one is safe. And the other way of saying that is a blow against one is a blow against all. So there's we have to stand together. And unfortunately, the way that the pandemic response has been very unfair in the distribution of vaccines reminds us that there's still a very long way to go before we live in a world that's fair and just.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
No.
So I guess as students, we've just come off of watching this documentary, and we're very inspired to kind of act. I'm wondering, kind of thinking about what we can do as students and as living, I guess, in our country, in our county, and being kind of citizens of the world. Like, what is something that we can do to act and to come out of COVID safer?
Well, again, I mean, that's a great question. And Anita and Esther tell us what they want. They say, be activists for climate change. And that means not just sort of putting up posters around school, though honestly, I did that when I was your age, and it worked. But it worked to an extent. It made me feel good, and it did point out that there were some people at least thinking about this kind of thing. But if we're serious about change, then I think the kind of model that Greta Thunberg offers is an inspirational and important one. At some point, it's not okay to carry on business as usual. We can't carry on doing what we're doing, this isn't to say that there's any kind of ideological purity. We're all caught up in all of this mess. I'm going to the climate change summit next week. How am I getting there? I'm flying. Is that not inimical to a climate sustainable future? Yes. But as soon as you let one contradiction be the intellectual sort of gotcha moment, you're forgetting all the other things that that need to happen. And what ultimately needs to happen is not, yes, there's a certain amount of lifestyle change, and yes, doing things like not eating meat or eating less, eating sustainably, supporting your local farmers, and buying kale. All of that's important, but in a sense, it's not individuals as individuals who are making sort of small tweaks to behavior that's going to change the problem. It's the structures in which we find ourselves and the systems in which we find ourselves that allow us to be sort of overwhelmed by this problem, and where the greatest polluters and the greatest criminals of climate damage don't ever get to pay a price and don't have to be part of the solution. So, becoming activists around climate change means taking on the fossil fuel companies very directly. It means, defending water. It means working and taking leadership from indigenous communities, and looking at the organizing that's happening within unions for a sustainable future and a just transition away from the jobs we have now to the jobs we need in the future. Luckily, there are lots of